Professor Carrington, we welcome you back to Constitutional Chats. Could you please tell us a little bit about America's principle of self-governing, and then we'll go to questions.
Yes, thank you for having me again. It's always good to be back with friends and talking about things that are so substantive and that I think are something that citizens should be talking with each other about. And I think that the issue of popular government is obviously an essential one. And we often can sometimes talk about it in assuming ways. In other words, we all assume that we have a popular government, that we should have a popular government. Our political discourse is usually built around appeals to whatever politician is talking, he or she is on the side of the people. And so I think a good thing we can do in this forum is step back just a little bit and try to illuminate some of the underpinnings about what is a popular government and how have we as Americans been committed to it. And I really want to do this in a way that maybe helps us to both know ourselves better as Americans and assess ourselves better as Americans who have this commitment to this form of government and have it in relation to or in contrast to maybe other forms that are out there. And so I want to get into that a little bit with more the body of what I'd like to say, because drawing off the essay that you all very graciously published from me, I really built off the famous ending of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, where he famously says that one of the purposes for the cause of the Union during the Civil War was the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And that's become such a well-known phrase that, again, I think that sometimes we miss the depth of it and how much in those short phrases Lincoln was packing some very deep thoughts. And the work is really being done by the prepositions, because the refrain of the people is there in each of the three sub-statements, but each preposition of, by, and for is doing a lot of work to explain both what popular government is and why it is a good thing. And so I just want to mention those a little briefly that might give us some fodder for talking more together. So he began the first phrase, of the people. Of is a preposition, in this case, of origin, where, and it's an origin of what? When it says government of the people, it's actually the question of who rules. The question of where a government comes from is really the question of who's in charge, who gets to make the laws, who gets to carry them out. And underneath that is one of the most fundamental questions of politics, because who rules depends upon this fundamental question: are all human beings equal or not? In monarchies, where you have the rule of one, they are based off fundamentally the idea that humans are unequal and that there is one above the rest that has a right to rule over the rest of the country or the rest of the political community. Aristocracies or oligarchies are systems that also believe in inequality, but rather than one above the rest, it's a group that gets to dictate to the rest because they're unequally superior. We've rejected all of those. Our Constitution begins, we, the people of the United States, ordain and establish this Constitution. So we have said that we believe in the equality of human beings, which means that human beings equally share in originating and creating government, and that's required based on that principle. And so we are building a government that is of the people off the idea of human equality and what that means for legitimate government. And that carries over. Not only does government originate from us, so we come together and create one as equal human beings, but government is also by the people, because you could have a situation where the people create the government and then give it away to others to do by themselves. But the principle of human equality really demands that we be active participants in the very government that we created. So we don't sit back and let others do it for us. We're actively involved. And this can look different. It can look like voting. It can look like office holding. It can look like merely participating in discussions about what our goals and purposes should be, what our policies and laws should be. But again, the government is meant to be run not by a special group of elite super people, but ultimately by the authority and with the participation of we regular citizens of the country. And I think a thing to think about that is we one question to always ask with that is that demands something of our character. If you look at political thinkers, I'm thinking of the French thinker Montesquieu that was so influential in the American founding, or if you look at George Washington's farewell address, they all talk that republics or governments by the people are the hardest. Why? Because you want your rulers to be virtuous, and we can talk about what that means, but you want them to be virtuous. And the best manifestation of that is the people, and republics demand that the greatest number of people be virtuous. A king, you need one virtuous person. An aristocracy, you need a few. In popular government, you need the majority of the people to be. So that's what it means for by the people to affirm popular government. And then briefly, for the people. This goes from saying, where does government come from, or who administers the government, to the question of for what purpose? What are our goals? And government is going to be working toward at least the perceived good of somebody. And again, some governments are only working for the good of one man or for a select few. By being a government for the people, the argument is that ours is dedicated to the good of the people in general. The good of all citizens or all residents of the political community. And I think for Lincoln, who said that statement, that goes back to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, which he called his ancient faith, actually. And the idea that human equality includes the protection of certain natural rights, rights that are given to you because you're a human being, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that a government for the people is going to be cognizant of that, and it's going to dedicate itself to protecting those rights, this principle of liberty for all. And so I think that if you can understand how of, by, and for commits us to government that originates from the people, that is run by the people, and that is for the good of the people, I think you can really have a good baseline for the nature of our government. And so I think it is something that we can talk more about that has served us well. I think it does reflect something about what human beings owe to each other, and that it is something that we should be committed to, not just because it's ours, but because there is something good in how it treats other human beings. So with that, I'm happy to continue the discussion and talk with you all.
Well, thank you. And that's just, I love how you utilize President Lincoln's quote of the people, by the people, for the people to illustrate your points. So thank you so much for that. Janine, do you want to?
Sure. Yes, Adam Carrington, that was wonderful. Thank you so very much. And you know, I'm in DC, so I got this book, The American History. It's conversations with master historians. It's about John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and such. And then I bought, look, I haven't read this yet. Have you read this?
Yes. There are, by the way, more books written about Lincoln every year than every other American, and almost more than every other person in history. But that is one of the standards. Yeah. So it's a good story.
They're saying this was supposed to be one of the best. David Herbert Donald's
Yep.
So I look, it's like 700 pages. So here we go. I mean, the one I read on and Tova read, and we all read for our book study was on Washington, Rod Chernows. That was really awesome too.
Oh,
But
that's excellent.
yeah, isn't it though? Everybody should read it. It should be required reading. But I went over to the Ford Theater yesterday and today, and they do have that tree of all the books of Jefferson, Lincoln, all the book, the tree of books. I don't know if y'all have ever seen that when you go across the street to the gift shop, but wow, it is great that you put this around Lincoln, especially since I've been. Yesterday I saw where he passed at the Peterson House, and then I saw today the theater where he was shot. So Lincoln's really on my mind. And I'm looking at this. There are two things, and you really laid this out very well. But that's why I'm thinking. I think we said it on this show. If not, I've been reading it for our essays. But the past is prologue. You've heard of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
The past is prologue, and that's actually Shakespeare, from what I understand. It came from Shakespeare, but it's on the statue outside of the archives. The past is prologue, and I really do like that, and how important it is to understand the past so that we can go forward in the future. And so many of us don't really understand the past, and that's why it's great to hear you describe these things. It's interesting. He says he doesn't want this to perish. He says in the Gettysburg Address, the dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God, which is nothing, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. So I have three questions to toss to you quickly, and then I'll toss it over to Tova. But he does mention under God, which is interesting because our Creator in the Declaration of Independence, it says Creator. So I think that's worthy of note because, and the other, I'd love to know your thoughts on that. And then the new birth of freedom. And I think about that. It kind of, the past is prologue, but also the new birth of freedom. I think we're in an interesting state in our country right now where we need to kind of come together and find a new re-enlightenment, a new birth of freedom as we come together to, instead of separating, we unite. So freedom can be trampled in a lot of different ways. And that shall not perish, shall not perish. So my three questions are kind of about that he mentions under God and the value of that, what you think about that, and shall not perish from the earth. You talked about we need to understand our past to go forward, but if you just want to elaborate on what we as citizens need to do to make sure this doesn't perish from the earth, and also the new birth of freedom.
Right.
Where we are with that, with the new birth of freedom.
Yeah, very good questions that do helpfully bring in the rest of the Gettysburg Address. I'm reminded that the Gettysburg Address is, I believe, 275 or 76 words, yet so much is packed into them. And the phrase under God, I think Lincoln is again thinking of the Declaration of Independence as you linked it to. And it's interesting that the Declaration of Independence, when it talks about people are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that's the second reference to God in the Declaration. The first reference is the laws of nature and nature's God. And I always like to ask my students, why refer to God with a different name the second time? Why say God the first time, creator the second time? And I think the question of under God is answering a question about what is the origin of the purpose of government when you have a government for the people. Is the origin of our rights from history, just they've developed this way? And Lincoln and the Declaration would say no. Is their origin ultimately from the will of the people themselves? We vote on what rights you have. Well, one of the essential differences between Lincoln and Stephen Douglas about slavery was Stephen Douglas said, well, I've got the fix to slavery. We'll vote on it because we're a popular government. And Lincoln says, I love popular government, but no, you don't vote. You don't exercise the equality you have to declare other people unequal. That's not part of it. So if they're not from history, if it's not from a vote of the people, where does it come from? And the origin is it comes in who you are as a human being. And the reason the Declaration uses the word creator is it's saying your rights come from a source that is greater than any human being, and that gave you those rights in the very making of you as a human being. To be human is to have these rights. And I think that is seen, even whether you're religious or not, that is a pretty powerful basis for where your rights come from. And that is meant as both a way to empower government to do its job, and it's meant as a limit to government to make sure that it stays within a role that was given to it, not that it created for itself. It's really a opposition to tyranny. With the new birth of freedom, I think parries off that, because again, in conversation with the Declaration of Independence, you know, the Declaration says we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address says that our nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. What's the difference between a self-evident truth and a proposition? And I think what he's admitting is that what's supposed to be our most fundamental assertion, human equality and freedom, is being contested. That as much as we believe that should be the basis of our government, we have not worked it out perfectly, and that we have people that don't necessarily perfectly agree about it. And the new birth of freedom is calling us to both a renewed commitment to those principles of equality and liberty, but it's also calling us, by being a new birth, to a better fidelity to them. That there have been imperfections in in our practice, slavery being the obvious one that is at play in what Lincoln is saying, and that this new birth of freedom in some ways will be a recommitment, but it will also be a recommitment that changes us in a particular way, and how we extend the freedom that we were committed to more people. Realize the true meaning of our creed, as Martin Luther King Jr. said 100 years after that. And I think what he's then saying is, in relation to both questions, God, which is really the for the people, a new birth of freedom, which is, I think, an extension of that. The not perishing from the earth goes back to if we cannot realize our principles better, if we can't resolve this question of liberty for all, then we risk government, we risk our experiment in self-government failing. And that what do we need to do for that? We need to be committed to these principles I was discussing earlier that Lincoln articulates. And we need to have the virtues of self-government, the virtues of being part of a community together, the virtues of being committed to justice, that if we're not able to do that, we're not going to be able to maintain our own government. And so the idea of the perishing is that good government is not a given. Popular government is not to be assumed. It's something that we have to work at, continue to build on. And the idea of a new birth of freedom, I think, is very connected to that. So I've gone on for a while, so I'll stop there. But that
was well said, though. I think that deserves applause. I think that was really good. That was really good. And to recap what you said, I really liked. Who was it that said, "Let's vote about our freedoms"? And Lincoln said, "No, you can't vote about freedoms. Freedoms are innate, right? They're inherent."
That was Stephen Douglas in the Lincoln-Douglas debates.
Oh, interesting.
And you know, ultimately Lincoln understood that Stephen Douglas's argument was just a dressed up version of might makes right, where rather than the might manifesting itself as guns or armor or strength, it was manifesting itself as whatever the majority says is just and right. And he flips it. He says, what's the whole reason we have voting, consent, government of the people? It's a claim underneath that, which is a claim to equality. So you can't vote on slavery because you're exercising your equality to undermine the very principle of equality. Right defines might doesn't make right. And I think that was what was underneath that debate.
That's
and why
really
Lincoln
good.
opposed it. Yeah.
That's really good. We've been talking a lot about the majority and the minority, you know, in the country, and whether in any kind of genre you want to put that in, but that the minority needs to feel like they're heard, and in order to accept a vote of majority, so to speak. But as long as there's a debate and a deliberation, but that's really good too, to talk about the fact that you know, just because you're the majority, it doesn't mean you get to vote out inherent rights. That's really good. That's really good. I think we have that a lot in our culture today. Well, you know, the majority of people say this, so we don't need it anymore. But that's not the principle of it. It's that it's inherent. And that's why we need to understand our principles, because if you don't understand that basic tenet of our country, then the populace could potentially get carried away with that type of thinking. It would be really cool to read the Lincoln Douglas debates. I think that would be, is there a book on that? Wouldn't that be interesting to read?
You can get, I mean, you can find them online, but there is a published edition of the Lincoln Douglas debates. And I would say that if you'd also like an introduction to both the history of what was going on and the logic, there's a book by one of the biggest Lincoln historians alive, Alan Guelzo, who's now at Princeton. And he's written a book on the Lincoln Douglas debates as well. So both read them yourself, but also read that book. That's a really good background.
He gives a little commentary on it. Yeah. Okay, Alan, what?
Guelzo, Guelzo, and he has written a series of books on Lincoln. I think he might be the greatest living Lincoln scholar at the time of this time. So.
Okay, well, I'm gonna toss it to Tova. I'll just say I just think that's really, really great. No, you don't get to vote away these rights. The majority doesn't get to muscle these rights away. We're born with them. I really like that. Okay, thank you. I have to toss now. So Tova, it's all yours.
Hi, thank you so much for that overview. That was really interesting, and I love all the quotes you said. I feel like they're very memorable, like, you know, the past is prologue and might doesn't make right. I love that framework. So I was wondering, talking about this idea of self-government and self-governing, can you talk about what the founding fathers, in pioneering this idea, what they were reacting to? So what was the system before, where there wasn't self-government? What did that look like? And what convinced them that they needed to build a society on the basis of self-government? That's my question.
Right. Yeah. And you know, I would say that they were very in tune with two histories. One was the history of Western civilization, like going back to the Greeks and the Romans and those regimes. And they were very familiar, obviously, with their own background, predominantly. I mean, they're immigrants from all over Europe, but predominantly their background with the English system. And so they certainly, one of the questions they sort of asked was, again, starting with the fundamental question, are human beings equal? And they looked at the history of societies and saw many societies that said no, and treated people accordingly, thought that there were natural inequalities. There are people that, you know, didn't deserve the same rights as others. And they and their own experience said that's not true. And that was both an engagement with English Enlightenment philosophy, John Locke, the Scottish Enlightenment, and it was also an engagement with biblical Christianity, that the claims, I mean, the biggest abolitionists, this is past the founding when you were asking, but, you know, the biggest abolitionists tended to be some form of Christian who believed that they were accentuating the claims of God creating everyone in his own image, right? And so that commitment to human equality really was this building point for everything else. But in engaging with the other history, the other thing they then asked is, they said, well, why has a government based on human equality of, by, and for the people, why is it such an exception and not a rule? And why did even the ones that tried it, Rome to some limited degree when it was a republic, Athens to some limited degree, although nothing to the degree we tried even from the beginning, why did they fail? Why did they all turn into despotisms? And the Federalist Papers deal with this a lot. Their question was not merely what's right, but what is needed to accomplish what's right. So once they had this commitment to equality, liberty, they then said republics that have been committed to this in the past have tended to fail miserably. And so they tried to learn from those histories to say, and this is where we get systems like separation of powers and federalism, bills of rights, things like that. But then also it was something I tried to allude to when in my opening statements. It's not merely those structures and lists and all that. It's the character of a people, because self-government starts with your ability to regulate your own passions, your own desires, to orient them toward what's good and right, to orient them toward the good of others. And it's only when a people individually and corporately show that they have that kind of mastery of their own minds and hearts that they are equipped to do a good job of exercising their own equality. It's sort of like, are human beings equal and free naturally? Yes, but some abuse it and some do a good job with it. And so that's what I think they're building off ultimately. And they really did believe England took big steps toward that. But they believed that they were finally doing it in a way that had not been done before, to a degree that had not been done before.
Yeah, that was a great overview. I think you displayed that in a really clear way. And then kind of following up on that, are there any sort of notable examples or case studies that come to mind for you throughout American history where you feel like this principle of self-government has sort of been challenged, or we've had to work as a country to uphold it?
Oh, absolutely. And what's really interesting is I'll go back to Lincoln. I'm also teaching a 1-week course here on the statesmanship of Lincoln. So I've got lots of Lincoln on the brain right now. It's all overlapping. But Lincoln was confronting the question of slavery and the claim that the fact that we had race-based slavery made the founders hypocrites, and that they didn't really believe it was all human beings, it was all white European men, or those kind of arguments. And he had to take that very seriously, because obviously whatever we say about equality and freedom, not everyone had it, and not everyone was being given it by law. And I thought he had a very perceptive, this is in his speech replying to the Dred Scott decision, one of the most infamous Supreme Court decisions. And his argument was that he believed that all men meant all human beings, but it wasn't a statement of what we were doing. It was a statement of commitment to what we should be doing. That there were problems, there were challenges that made it so we could not fully realize our principles immediately. But here's what he said: by declaring all men are created equal, all men have equal natural rights, at the beginning, it became our conscience, really. It became our star and compass. And if you then look throughout American history, it is amazing how many of the reform movements that come up in America consciously ground themselves in the Declaration of Independence and consciously say, we're not calling you, America, to repudiate who you are. We're calling you to be a even better or more truer version of yourself. So slavery obviously was one of those. And I think I've talked enough about that I won't belabor it. The civil rights movement, I mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. saying, we need to live out the true meaning of our creed. And it was a reference back to the Declaration of Independence. If you look at women's suffrage and women's rights, the Seneca Falls Declaration is a clever rewriting of the Declaration of Independence itself to say all men really should be all human beings. And here's what we think needs to happen for you to really realize that. And what's amazing is how effective that has been. in American history. That when Americans are truly shown that our founding principle, our founding commitment is something that we're not being consistent with, it's amazing how it has been our conscience, our star, our compass, something that we have reformed ourselves to and toward, and still not perfectly. Lincoln himself said, maybe we'll never perfectly attain it, but it will be our conscience, and that's a good thing, rather than using the Declaration to merely pat ourselves on the back and act like we've arrived. We're always working to arrive. And the Declarations, I think, has been a part of that discussion from the beginning, and is still here now. In fact, the last thing I'll say, I've gone on too long, but look at President Obama's second inaugural address. It is grounded in the Declaration of Independence. So from then back to the 1776, that's been our starting point and what we've worked toward and from.
Yeah, I really like that idea that we're constantly like redefining ourselves in relation to our founding ideals and making sure we're upholding them. So I really like that. And then going back to something you said earlier, you were discussing the idea of virtuous leaders, and how in a society with self-governing, we sort of all have to develop virtues and sort of stay engaged. So I was wondering if you could expand a bit more on what virtues those are. What did the founding fathers view as virtues that people should have? And I'm also curious, were the founders optimistic that most people would in fact have these virtues, or were there some that were a bit more pessimistic about that prospect?
That's a great. Those are two great questions, and I would say a couple places to look on specific lists of virtues. Look at some of the state constitutions during 1776, 1778. Virginia's, Massachusetts are two good examples. Pennsylvania's, and they will list out the kind of virtues they think their citizens and those their citizens are electing need to have. But I think they were all classically trained in classical Greco-Roman, Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, and think of the four cardinal virtues. And I think all the others sort of stem from this. You need courage. If you don't have courage, then none of the other virtues matter, because you'll never have the determination to exercise them. Justice. You need to know in exercising your courage what's good, and therefore what your courage should be pursuing. Temperance meaning self-control, self-government in that sense, that human beings are imperfect, but they need to regulate themselves for the good of themselves and others. And finally, prudence. Prudence is the hardest one, because prudence is really the attempt to, in light of what's good, and in light of what's good being situated in an imperfect world, what's the best possible? How do we, in an imperfect world, achieve the greatest justice possible with our courage, with our temperance or self-control? So I think the other virtues that get listed really stem from that, and they were the kind of things that the founders wanted, and the kind of thing the founders pushed very hard. This is why John Adams says we need a robust system of schooling that's available to all people, regardless of social class, economic class, so that they can become learned in these things. They can become trained in these things. They can have minds and hearts built toward this. How capable human beings were of this? One of the arguments of despots is that humans are so bad that they can't govern themselves. Someone else needs to take care of them. And I will say that the American founders had a healthy view of human depravity. And some more than others. James Wilson from Pennsylvania was a little more positive on human nature. Alexander Hamilton and John Adams were very dark on human nature, on how human beings could be bad, the bad things they could do to each other or to themselves. You know, Madison is the one that wrote in Federalist 51, if all men were angels, we wouldn't need government. And if it were run by angels, we wouldn't need, you know, government restrictions, government limitations. But both the positive about human nature, the possibility of human nature, and the downfalls of human nature, both for them pointed to the need for government of the people. The possibility of human nature says all human beings can have at least the potential to lift themselves up to great heights of achievement and to great heights of moral and intellectual development. And we should not designate someone because of whose their parents were or the color of their skin or fill in the blank about what they can achieve. At the same time, the idea that people can be tyrannical and evil says, well, how about we distribute this power out to everybody so that they themselves, so that no one person's depravity can become the only mark for how a government is supposed to operate. So both what humans were capable of achieving and what for good and for ill both became a basis for the argument that we should have self-government.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much. Those are some very clear virtues: courage, justice, temperance. I think those are all great, and I think not always the ones that are most prioritized in our society. So thank you for telling us about those. And now I'll pass on to Jill and Jordan. But thank you so much for your time and for being with us today.
Of course, thank you.
Hello. So number one, what constitutes, we're talking about self-government, government of the people. How do you think we can think of a people? What constitutes a people, especially since it was not, we were primarily from England, but there were certainly those in the colonies that didn't fully identify still as English, even though the majority of the founders did.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question, because one of the issues that any country any political community has to determine is what makes us not just a collection of individuals or a collection of subgroups, but one. So the motto, e pluribus unum, right? Out of many, one. But what is that one? And I think that ultimately the fact that we've grounded our particular regime, our particular form of government in universal claims of human equality and liberty, ultimately says that what it means to be an American or to be a person beyond questions of legality, you know, being a citizen, legally naturalized or born. I'm not so much talking about that, but it's ultimately, one, do you share a commitment to these principles? And two, do you have the virtues, at least enough of the virtues, to exercise them well? And I think the argument of the founders and subsequent generations is, are all human beings capable of seeing the truth of those principles and having lives ordered toward them? It's possible, but it's certainly true that if you grow up in a situation where you are taught those principles from birth, or you are taught by your community and parents and others to exercise the virtues necessary to self-govern, you are going to have an advantage in exercising that universal human good. So, and by the way, and that there might be some people who, through no fault of their own, grow up in despotic governments, grow up in situations where they just haven't had the blessing or privilege of being brought up, and it might be harder for them, not because there's anything wrong inherently with them, not because they're not equal to others, but because of that difference. So that's why education is so essential to the American project. If we aren't educating ourselves and each other, then we are asking to create people who are either too ignorant to govern themselves or who get the wrong principles and want to be tyrants. And so that would be my basic answer to that.
And it
It
really-
is something that's open to all humans, but there are conditions of education that make that easier or harder to realize.
And that makes us totally unique, and it's something that it makes America's idea of the people unique. And still, even today, the ability to become American is something that on this podcast we've talked about, and it is a special concept. It does raise a question that you may disagree with some implications on, but it's faster if I just ask the question, since the format of the podcast. But there are foundational principles in the formation of our government, which are recognized as Judeo-Christian principles. And those principles are at the same time kind of what grounds us in being a people, as we've pretty much seen. And the time of the Constitution, one of the things that was amazing I learned on this podcast was this understanding that the Bill of Rights is what, at the time of it was being instituted, referred to what the federal government could do, not necessarily what the state governments could do. And it wasn't until around the 14th Amendment and interpretations of the 14th Amendment when it was extended down to the states. So how that relates is that, and my question is, we've seen the concept of separation of church and state eliminate principles being accepted as the common principles of people here in America. And it kind of seems like as we kind of run into losing some of what makes us us as we try to stress that separation in every public forum.
Yeah, that is there is a lot to unpack in what you were asking, and maybe the quickest way I can try to at least dip into it is to go back to what I would say is maybe not one of our ultimate founding documents, but it would be the next tier right below the big ones, the Constitution, the Declaration, and that is the Northwest Ordinance that was passed first in 1787, then repassed in 1788. That governed the only territory the United States owned at the time. So it was the national government saying, if we want to set up a territory, what principles do we want? And it talks about religion in two ways. First, it does say there is a public place for religion. It says that religion, morality, and the religion and morality are essential to good government and the happiness of human beings. So it really does see religion as part of what it means to have a good government and happiness. Washington very much connected morality and the virtues of self-government to some kind of belief in God. So you certainly have those. At the same time, Article 1 of the Northwest Ordinance commits us to, as the First Amendment does, but this was even before the First Amendment, religious liberty. The idea that we will never force someone to believe something religiously that they don't, or to violate their natural God-given rights because they do or don't believe in God at all, or because they don't believe in the same theology as someone else. So that's been a tension throughout American history. We have a robust commitment to religious liberty and a robust commitment that that we tend to think religion is a good thing. That it does tend to help form us in a positive way. And that's certainly been the argument that many of the founders made, Washington, John Adams, among others. And I think that, so I think underneath keeping both of those commitments together would be in line with what the founders were arguing. And that the idea is that religion is a kind of education. It is a kind of education what human beings are, where justice comes from, and what we owe to each other. It's no it's no coincidence that again, Martin Luther King Jr. was a clergyman, right? So I don't think that means that you can't adhere to these principles without being religious, but it is at least Washington's argument is, there are certain advantages to that religious foundation, so long as it doesn't violate the religious liberty of all people.
And that's very interesting, even as you spoke of that they understood religious liberty as not as an element of natural law, not to be violated, while at the same time it's having our declaration, having our founding documents mention our creator and our rights being unalienable. Jordan told me while you were talking that I stole his question, because we don't normally talk about our questions beforehand, so that we don't and we just end up normally not we almost never ask the same thing. But so I don't know if there's something else that you want to.
I could. I don't know, Kathy, is there time for another question, or do we need to get to some audience questions?
Yeah, if you want to ask a question, I think we definitely have time.
Okay.
Well, I guess I'll kind of build off of that, off of where we just were. You talked about how the founders were committed to not forcing religion upon anybody, but it almost seems that there was a unspoken thought that our government believed in a higher power, and that the morals that the government would follow we were under that higher power. And now I look at us presently, and it seems like even just the moral side of that is a little bit strained. And I would just like to kind of hear your piece on this, even if you try to separate the religious aspect from the moral aspect of it, which is difficult to do. It seems like those morals should be understood by everyone because they make a good people. And I think that those morals are a little bit ignored now.
Well, and two things I'd say. One about religious liberty is the idea of separation of church and state isn't necessarily the secularization of government itself. What it's saying is the state should not run the church should not run the state. And what it did also say is there shouldn't be coercion. So you should not hold a gun to someone's head and say, confess the Nicene Creed or believe in the Quran, or, you fill in whatever. That's different than government officials expressing opinions or encouraging certain arguments or ideas. It's one thing to confuse advocacy for coercion, I think, is where we get into a lot of misunderstandings of what we do now versus the founding. Advocacy is not coercion and vice versa necessarily. And as long as you can advocate without coercing. The other is the question of what do we do with the issue of the good that religion possibly can do. And I think one way the founders understood it was, if you're Christian or adhere to Judaism, for example, Psalm 19 says the second half is all about the law of God being a good thing. The first half is the heavens declare the glory of God. So when the Declaration talks about the laws of nature and nature's God, the idea is that there is a declaration of what's good about human beings that they did believe came from God, but that it was perceivable by our reason by looking at nature, not necessarily by a particular holy text or something like that. And that God speaks to all human beings through their reason. And that access of reason is something that all human beings equally have and can equally learn from. So I won't keep going on that, but I think that again goes back to education too.
Well, thank you, Jewel and Jordan, and thank you, Tova and Janine, for your great questions. And we want to take a minute and give a shout out to our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM. This program airs on Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific in Las Vegas on KKVV. So thank you for tuning in there. We also want to recognize our students who are on with us today from Cornerstone Academy, students of Tracy Schaefer from Cornerstone Academy. So welcome to those students. And if you're a student on with us today and we didn't mention you, put your name in the Q&A and we'll give you a shout out. So Professor, just with the time that we have left, Jill asks, can you identify a time period in U.S. history when we've best aligned ourselves with the concept of the people, by the people, and for the people? Or are we still a long way from attaining those?
Oh, that's a hard question. And I don't mean to punt on it, but I think it depends upon what element. So I think in the, especially in the, say, the period between the founding and the Civil War, we really did have a lot of, as Tocqueville, the French thinker, saw, active participation by the people. In the formation of our government, our Constitution and the Declaration, we really saw at its best a government of the people originating. And then for the people, I think in some of the reform movements that we have seen that I talked about before, the ending of slavery, the women's suffrage, the civil rights movement, we really achieved better and better versions of for the people. And I don't think that it's necessarily all upward. There are ways I could go into if we had more time where I think that, sometimes our desire for expert government sometimes means we do tend to relinquish control to, say, bureaucrats or the bureaucracy, and not that they're bad people, just that we sometimes don't actively keep ourselves connected to being part of government. I think that's worse than it's been in the past. And so I think that it sort of depends. I don't think that there was ever a Garden of Eden. Even though I think there's been very good things, I think it again is we're getting better and worse at different times, trying more and more to accomplish these goals. So again, it depends upon what element of, by, and for the people we're talking about. Where eras I think we're better or worse at that.
Very interesting. And as a follow-up to that, Jill also says that you mentioned we need a renewed commitment to virtues. How do you suggest we go about that? What are the best steps to return to these? And she writes that she feels we're so far away from any of these: courage, justice, temperance, etc.
Yeah. So education in two senses. I know I've come back to education, but we often sometimes think of education as just the mind, and that matters. Some people don't even know about these, at least not to the degree they need to do anything about them. So recommitting education to be not just about getting a job, but about cultivating the mind, but also education is about cultivating the heart and cultivating habits of wanting to do these things and understanding that they're good and pursuing them. And I think that's going to take schools doing it. It's going to take parents and neighbors being committed to it with each other. And I think it's going to take that kind of communal effort and communal dedication. And by the way, I think that can be done. I'll give an example that's not exactly the same, but when we thought we were falling behind the Russians in the space race, we poured money, but not just money, structures, teachers, individual commitment into catching up on math, science, things like that, and ended up, I think we did pretty well with the space race. Can we do that on the questions of the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues? And I think that is really going to take just making it a priority in our personal lives, making it a priority legislatively, doing all those things together. And I think that's where it ultimately can happen, if it's going to happen at all.
Well, of course, that's what y'all do at Hillsdale so well, and what we strive to do at Constituting America. And so that's a great way to wrap up today's show. We're right at the top of the hour, and just want to check in real quick to see if Janine has any closing comments she wants to make, or Tova. or Jewel and Jorn?
I'm good. I'll just say, Adam Carrington, you're amazing. What a great show. It's like 5-star, one of our best. Thank you so much. And thanks to our wonderful panel too. Really wonderful show. And thanks everyone for listening.
Yes, thank you to our audience, and come back next week. We're going to be talking about the principle of providence. So join us Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. And we thank y'all. Have a great week. Bye.
Bye.